Section 47 of The Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner, Ballyclare. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Section 47. Builders and Weavers. No one can examine birds and their ways for long together without being struck by the wonderful neatness and cleverness of their proceedings. They make use of a great many different kinds of materials for their nests, and manage somehow to turn out a nest which not only will hold eggs, but is strong and of a pretty shape. Rotten twigs are, curiously enough, what they love best for the outside, and upon the twigs various substances are laid, according to the species and taste of the builder. The jay, for instance, collects roots and twists them into a firm mass, which he lays upon the twigs. The American starling uses tough wet rushes and coarse grass, and after they are matted together, somehow ties the nest on to reeds or a bush, while the missel thrush lines the casing of twigs with tree moss, or even hay. To these they often add tufts of wool and lichen, and the whole is fastened together by a kind of clay. The favourite spot chosen by the missel thrush is the fork of a tree in an orchard, where lichens are large and plentiful enough to serve as a covering for the nests. Still, if the account given by Vallant and Patterson is true, the sociable grosbeaks surpass all the other birds in skill and invention. They have been known to cover the trunks of trees with a huge kind of fluted umbrella, made of dry, fine grass, and the boughs of the trees poking through in various places. No doubt in the beginning the nest was not so large, but it is the custom of these birds to live together in clans, and each year fresh rooms have to be added. When examined, the bird city was found to have many gates and regular streets of nests, each about 2 inches distant from the other. The structure was made of bushmen's grass alone, but so tightly woven together that no rain could get through. The nests were all tucked in under the roof, which, by projecting, formed eaves, thus keeping the birds warm and dry. Sometimes the umbrella has been known to contain as many as 300 separate nests, so it is no wonder that the tree at last breaks down with the weight, and the city has to be founded again elsewhere. Now, in the nests of all these birds there has been a good deal of what we call building and carpentry when we are talking of our own houses and our own trades, but there are a whole quantity of birds spread over the world who are almost exclusively weavers, and can form nests which hang down from the branches of a tree without any support. To this class belongs the Indian sparrow, which prefers to build in the tops of the very highest trees, especially on the Indian fig, and particularly on those growing by the riverside. He weaves together tough grass in the form of a bottle, and hangs it from a branch, so that it rocks to and fro like a hammock. The Indian sparrow, which is easily tamed, does not like always to live with his family, so he divides his nest into 2 or 3 parts, and is careful to place its entrance underneath, so that it may not attract the notice of the birds of prey. In these nests glowworms have frequently been found, carefully fastened into a piece of fresh clay. But whether the bird deliberately tries in this way to light up his dark nest, or whether he has some other use for the glowworm, has never been found out. But it seems quite certain that he does not eat it, as Sir William Jones once supposed. The Indian sparrow is a very clever little bird, and can be taught to do all sorts of tricks. He will catch a ring that is dropped into one of the deep Indian wells before it reaches the water. He can pick the gold ornament neatly off the forehead of a young Hindu woman, or carry a note to a given place like a carrier pigeon. At least, so it is said, but then very few people have even a bowing acquaintance with the Indian sparrow. End of section 47, recording by Chad Horner, Ballyclare.
Section 48 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sophia Koshik. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. More Faithful Than Favored, by Miss Eleanor Seller. There never was a more faithful watchdog than the great big-limbed, heavy-headed mastiff that guarded Sir Harry Lee's manor house, Ditchley, in Oxfordshire. The sound of his deep growl was the terror of all the gypsies and vagrants in the county, and there was a superstition among the country people that he was never known to sleep. Even if he was seen stretched out on the stone steps leading up to the front entrance of the house, with his massive head resting on his great forepaws, at the sound of a footfall, however distant, his head would be raised, his ears fiercely cocked, and an ominous stiffening of the tail would warn a stranger that his movements were being closely watched, and that on the least suspicion of anything strange or abnormal in his behavior, he would be called to account by Leo. Strangely enough, the mastiff had never been a favorite of his master's. The fact that dogs of his breed are useless for purposes of sport, owing to their unwieldy size and defective sense of smell, had prevented Sir Harry from taking much notice of him. He looked upon the mastiff merely as a watchdog. The dog would look after him, longing to be allowed to join him in his walk, or to follow him when he rode out through the lanes and fields round his house, but poor Leo's affection received little encouragement. So long as he guarded the house faithfully by day and night, that was all that was expected of him, and as in doing this he was only doing his duty and fulfilling the purpose for which he was there, little notice was taken of him by any of the inmates of the house. His meals were supplied to him with unfailing regularity, for his services as ensuring the safety of the house were fully recognized, but as Sir Harry had not shown him any signs of favor, the servants did not think fit to bestow unnecessary attention on him. So he lived his solitary, neglected life, in summer and winter, by night and day, zealous in his master's interest, but earning little reward in the way of notice or affection. One night, however, something occurred that suddenly altered the mastiff's position in the household, and from being a faithful slave, he all at once became the beloved friend and constant companion of Sir Harry Lee. It was in winter, and Sir Harry was going up to his bedroom as usual, about 11 o'clock. Great was his astonishment on opening the library door to find the mastiff stretched in front of it. At sight of his master, Leo rose, and, wagging his tail and rubbing his great head against Sir Harry's hand, he looked up at him as if anxious to attract his attention. With an impatient word, Sir Harry turned away and went up the oak-panelled staircase, Leo following closely behind him. When he reached his bedroom door, the dog tried to follow him into the room, and if Sir Harry had been a more observant man, he must have noticed a curious look of appeal in the dog's eyes, as he slammed the door in his face, ordering him in commanding tones to "go away," an order which Leo did not obey. Curling himself up on the mat outside the door, he lay with his small, deep-sunk eyes in eager watchfulness, fixed on the door, while his heavy tail from time to time beat an impatient tattoo upon the stone floor of the passage. Antonio, the Italian valet, whom Sir Harry had brought home with him from his travels, and whom he trusted absolutely, was waiting for his master, and was engaged in spreading out his things on the toilet table. "That dog is getting troublesome, Antonio," said Sir Harry. "I must speak to the keeper tomorrow, and tell him to chain him up at night outside the hall. I cannot have him disturbing me, prowling around the corridors and passages all night. See that you drive him away when you go downstairs." "Yes, signor," replied Antonio, and began to help his master to undress. Then, having put fresh logs of wood on the fire, he wished Sir Harry good night, and left the room. Finding Leo outside the door, the valet whistled and called gently to him to follow him, and, as the dog took no notice, he put out his hand to take hold of him by the collar, but a low growl and sudden flash of the mastiff's teeth warned the Italian of the danger of resorting to force. With a muttered curse, he turned away, determined to try bribery where threats had failed. He thought that if he could secure a piece of raw meat from the kitchen, he would have no difficulty in inducing the dog to follow him to the lower regions of the house, where he could shut him up and prevent him from further importuning his master. Scarcely had Antonio's figure disappeared down the passage, when the mastiff began to whine in an uneasy manner and to scratch against his master's door. Disturbed by the noise, and astonished that his faithful valet had disregarded his injunctions, Sir Harry got up and opened the door, on which the mastiff pushed past him into the room with so resolute a movement that his master could not prevent his entrance. The instant he got into the room, the dog's uneasiness seemed to disappear. Ceasing to whine, he made for the corner of the room where the bed stood in a deep alcove, and crouching down he slunk beneath it, with an evident determination to pass the night there. Much astonished, Sir Harry was too sleepy to contest the point with the dog, and allowed him to remain under the bed, without making any further attempt to dislodge him from the strange and unfamiliar resting-place he had chosen. When the valet returned shortly after with a piece of meat with which he hoped to tempt the mastiff downstairs, he found the mat deserted. He assumed that the dog had abandoned his caprice of being outside his master's door, and had betaken himself to his usual haunts in the basement rooms and passages of the house. Whether from the unaccustomed presence of the dog in his room, or from some other cause, Sir Harry Lee was a long time in going to sleep that night. He heard the different clocks in the house strike midnight, and then 1 o'clock, and as he lay awake watching the flickering light of the fire playing on the old furniture and on the dark panels of the wainscot, he felt an increasing sense of irritation against the dog, whose low, regular breathing showed that he, at any rate, was sleeping soundly. Towards 2 in the morning, Sir Harry must have fallen into a deep sleep, for he was quite unconscious of the sound of stealthy steps creeping along the stone corridor and pausing a moment on the mat outside his room. Then the handle of the door was softly turned, and the door itself, moving on its well-oiled hinges, was gently pushed inward. In another moment there was a tremendous scuffle beneath the bed, and with a great bound the mastiff flung himself on the intruder and pinned him to the floor. Startled by the unexpected sounds, and thoroughly aroused, Sir Harry jumped up and hastily lit a candle. Before him on the floor lay Antonio, with the mastiff standing over him, uttering his fierce growls and showing his teeth in a dangerous manner. Stealthily, the Italian stole out his hand along the floor to conceal something sharp and gleaming that had fallen from him on the dog's unexpected onslaught. But a savage snarl from Leo warned him to keep perfectly still. Calling off the mastiff, who instantly obeyed the sound of his master's voice, though with bristling hair and stiffened tail, he still kept his eyes fixed on the Italian. Sir Harry demanded from the valet the cause of his unexpected intrusion into his bedroom at that hour, and in that way. There was so much embarrassment and hesitation in Antonio's reply that Sir Harry's suspicions were aroused. In the meantime, the unusual sounds at that hour of the night had awakened the household. Servants came hurrying along the passage to their master's room. Confronted by so many witnesses, the Italian became terrified and abject, and stammered out such contradictory statements that it was impossible to get at the truth of his story, and Sir Harry saw that the only course open to him was to have the man examined and tried by the magistrate. At the examination, the wretched valet confessed that he had entered his master's room with the intention of murdering and robbing him, and had only been prevented by the unexpected attack of the mastiff. Among the family pictures in the possession of the family of the Earls of Lichfield, the descendants of Sir Harry Lee, there is a full-length portrait of the knight with his hand on the head of the mastiff, and beneath this legend, "More faithful than favored." End of section 48. Recording by Sophia Koshik. Section 49 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sophia Koshik. The Animal Storybook. Edited by Andrew Lang. Dolphins, Turtles, and Cod. Stories from Audubon by Robert Williams Buchanan. In the excellent life of Mr. Audubon, the American naturalist, some curious stories are to be found respecting the kinds of fish that he met with in his voyages through the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Audubon's remarks about the habits of dolphins are especially interesting and will be read with pleasure by everybody who cares for the sea and all that in them is. Dolphins abound in the Gulf of Mexico and the neighboring seas, and are constantly to be seen chasing flying fish, which are their food. Flying fish can swim more rapidly than the dolphins, which of course are far larger creatures, but if they find themselves much outnumbered and in danger of being surrounded, they spread the fins that serve them for wings and fly through the air for a short distance. At first, this movement throws out the dolphins, who are unable to follow the example of their prey, but they soon contrive to keep up with the flying fish by giving great bounds into the air, and as the flying fish's powers are soon exhausted, it is not long before the hunt comes to an end and the dolphin sees the fish as they tumble into the sea. Sailors are fond of catching dolphins, and generally bait their hooks with a piece of shark's flesh. When the fish is taken, its friends stay round it till the last moment, only swimming away as the dolphin is hauled on board. For its size, which is generally about 3 feet long, and has rarely been known to exceed 4 feet, the dolphin has a remarkably good appetite, and sometimes he eats so much that he is unable to escape from his enemy, the bottle-nosed porpoise. A dolphin that was caught in the Gulf of Mexico was opened by the sailors, and inside him were counted 22 flying fish, each one 6 or 7 inches long, and all arranged quite neatly with their tails foremost. Before they have their dinner, they are full of fun, and their beautiful blue and gold bodies may often be seen leaping and bounding and diving about the ship, a sight which the sailors always declare portends a gale. Indeed, the stories to which dolphins give rise are many and strange. The Negroes believe that if a silver coin, fried or boiled in the same water as the fish, will turn into copper if the dolphin is in a state unfit for food, but as no one can swear that he has ever seen the transmutation of the metal, it may be suspected that the tale was invented by the cook for the sake of getting an extra $1. About 80 miles from the peninsula of Florida are a set of low, sandy banks known as the Tortuga, or Turtle Islands, from the swarms of turtles which lay their eggs in the sand and are eagerly sought for by traders. Turtles are of many sorts, but the green turtle is considered the best and is boiled down into soup, which is both rich and strengthening. They are cautious creatures and never approach the shore in the daylight or without watching carefully for some time to see if the coast is indeed clear. They may be seen on quiet moonlight nights in the months of May and June, lying 30 or 40 yards from the beach, listening intently, and every now and then making a loud hissing noise intended to frighten any enemies that may be lurking near. If their quick ears detect any sound, however faint, they instantly dive and swim to some other place. But if nothing is stirring, they land on the shore and crawl slowly about with the aid of their flappers until they find a spot that seems suitable for the hatching of their eggs, which often number 200, laid at one time. The operations are begun by the turtle scooping out a hole in the burning sand by means of her hind flappers, using them each by turns, and throwing up the sand into a kind of rampart behind her. This is done so quickly that in less than 10 minutes she will often have dug a hole varying from 18 inches to 2 feet. When the eggs are carefully placed in separate layers, the loose sand is laid over them, and the hole not only completely hidden, but made to look exactly like the rest of the beach, so that no one could ever tell that the surface had been disturbed at all. Then the turtle goes away and leaves the hot sand to do the rest. In course of time, the young turtles, hardly bigger than a 5-shilling piece, leave their shells and make their way to the water, unless, before they are hatched, their nest has been discovered by men or by the cougars and other wild animals who feed greedily on them. If they belong to the tribe of the green turtles, they will at once begin to seek for sea plants, and especially a kind of grass, which they bite off near the roots so as to get the tenderest parts. If they are young hawkbills, they will nibble the seaweed and soon go on to crabs and shellfish, and even little fishes. The loggerheads grow a sharp beak, which enables them to crack the great conch shells and dig out the fish that lives inside, while the trunk turtle, which is often of an immense size, but with a very soft body, loves sea urchins and shellfish. All of them can swim so fast that they often seem to be flying, and it needs much quickness of eye and hand to spear them in the water. Even to catch them on shore is a matter of great difficulty, and in general more than one man is required for the service. The turtle is raised up from behind by a man on his knee, pushing with all his might against her shoulder, but this has to be done with great caution, or else the hunter may get badly bitten. When the turtle is fully raised up, she is thrown over on her back, and, like a sheep in a similar position, can seldom recover herself without help. The turtles, when caught, are put into an enclosure of logs with a sandy or muddy bottom through which the tide flows, and here they are kept and fed by their captors until they are ready for the market. Unlike most creatures, their price is out of all proportion to their weight, and a loggerhead turtle, weighing 700 pounds, has been known to cost no more than a green turtle of 30. Early in May and well into June, the seas extending northwards from Maine to Labrador are alive with ships just starting for the cod fishing. Their vessels are mostly small but well stocked, and a large part of the space below is filled with casks, some full of salt and others empty. These empty ones are reserved for the oil that is procured from the cod. Every morning, as soon as it is light, some of the crew of each ship enters a small boat, which can be sailed or rowed as is found necessary. When they reach the cod banks, every man boards up part of his boat for the fish when caught, and then takes his stand at the end with 2 lines, baited at the opening of the season with salted mussels and later with gannets or caplings. These lines are dropped into the sea on either side of the boat, and when the gunwale is almost touching the water and it is dangerous to put in any more fish, they give up work for the morning and return to the harbor. In general, fishing is a silent occupation, but cod fishers are a rather talkative race and have bets with each other as to the amount of the takes of the respective crews. When they get back to their vessels, often anchored 8 or 10 miles away, they find that the men who have been left behind have set up long tables on deck, carried the salt barrels on shore, placed all ready the casks for the livers, and cleared the hold of everything but a huge wedge of salt for the salting. Then, after dinner, some of the men row back to the cod banks, while the others set about cleaning, salting, and packing the fish, so as to be quite finished when the men return from their second journey. It is almost always midnight before the work is done and the men can turn in for their 3 hours' sleep. If, as often happens, the hauls have been very large, the supply soon threatens to become exhausted, so on Sunday the captain sails off for a fresh bank. Then, the men who are laziest or most unskillful in the matter of fishing take out the cargo that has already been salted and lay it out on scaffolds which have been set up on the rocks. When the sun has dried the fish for some time, they are turned over, and this process is repeated several times in the day. In the evening, they are piled up into large stacks and protected from the rain and wind. In July, the men's work is in one way less hard than before, for this is the season when the caplings arrive to spawn upon the shores, and where caplings are, cod are sure to follow. Now great nets are used, with one end fastened to the land, and these nets will sometimes produce 20 or 30,000 fish at a haul. With so many men engaged in the cod fishing, and considering the number of diseases to which cod are subject, it is perhaps quite as well that each fish should lay such a vast supply of eggs, though out of the 8 million laid by one fish which have been counted, it is calculated that, from various causes, only about 100,000 come to maturity. End of section 49. Recording by Sophia Koshik.
Section 50 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. More About Elephants, from The Wild Elephant by Sir James Emerson Tennant. Long, long ago, when the moon was still young, and some of the stars that we know best were only gradually coming into sight, the earth was covered all over with a tangle of huge trees and gigantic ferns, which formed the homes of all sorts of enormous beasts. There were no men, only great animals and immense lizards, whose skeletons may still be found embedded in rocks or frozen deep down among the Siberian marshes. For, After the period of fearful heat, when everything grew rampant, even in the very north, there came a time of equally intense cold, when every living creature perished in many parts of the world. When the ice which crushed down life on the earth began to melt, and the sun once more had power to pierce the thick, cold mists that had shrouded the world, animals might have been seen slowly creeping about the young trees and fresh green pastures, but their forms were no longer the same as they once were. The enormous frames of all sorts of huge monsters and the great lizard called the ichthyosaurus had been replaced by smaller and more graceful creatures who could move lightly and easily through this new world. But changed though it seemed to be, one beast still remained to tell the story of those strange old times, and that was the elephant. Now anybody who has ever stood behind a big, clumsy cart horse going up a hill cannot fail to have been struck with its likeness to an elephant. And it is quite true that elephants and horses are nearly related. Of course, in the East, where countries are so big and marches are so long, it is necessary to have an animal to ride of more strength and endurance than a horse. And so elephants, who are, when well treated, as gentle as they are strong, were very early trained as beasts of burden, or even as men of war. In their wild condition, they have a great many curious habits. They roam about the forests of India or Africa in herds, and each herd is a real family who have had a common grandfather. The elephants are very particular as to the number of their herd. It is never less than 10 or more than 21, but being very sociable, they easily get on terms of civility with other herds, and several of these groups may be seen moving together towards some special pond or feeding ground. But friendly as they often are, each clan keeps itself as proudly distinct from the rest as if they were all Highlanders. Any unlucky elephant who has lost his own herd and tries to attach himself to a new one is scouted and beaten away by every member of the tribe, till, like a man who is punished and scorned for misfortunes he cannot help, the poor animal grows desperate and takes to evil courses, and is hunted down under the name of a rogue. Elephants have a great idea of law and order, and carefully choose a leader who is either strong enough or clever enough to protect the herd against its enemies. Even a female has sometimes been chosen if her wisdom has been superior to that of the rest, but male or female, the leader once fixed upon, the herd never fails to give him absolute obedience, and will suffer themselves to be killed in their efforts to save his life. As everyone knows, during the dry season in India, water becomes very scarce, and even the artificial tanks that have been built for reservoirs are very soon empty. About the middle of this century, an English officer, Major Skinner by name, had drawn up to rest on the embankment of a small Indian tank, which, low though it was, contained the only water to be found for a great distance. On 3 sides of the tank there was a clearing, but on the 4th lay a very thick wood, where the herd lay encamped all day, waiting for darkness to fall, so that they might all go to drink. Major Skinner knew the habits of elephants well, and what to expect of them, so he sent all his natives to sleep, and climbed himself into a large tree that sheltered the tank at one corner. However, it appeared that the elephants were unusually cautious that night, for he sat in his tree for 2 hours before a sound was heard, though they had been lively enough as long as the sun was shining. Suddenly, a huge elephant forced his way through the thickest part of the forest, and advanced slowly to the tank, his ears at full cock, and his eyes glancing stealthily around. He gazed longingly at the water for some minutes, but did not attempt to drink. Perhaps he felt it would be a mean advantage to take of his comrades, and then he quietly retraced his steps backwards till he had put about 100 yards between himself and the water. when 5 elephants came out of the jungle and joined him. These he led forward, listening carefully as before, and placed them at certain spots where they could command a view both of the open country and the forests. This done, and the safety of the others provided for, he went to fetch the main body of the herd, which happened to be 4 or 5 times as large as usual. Silently, as if preparing for an assault, the whole of this immense body marched up to where the scouts were standing, when a halt was signaled, so that the leader might for the last time make sure that no hidden danger in the shape of man, lion, or tiger awaited them. Then permission was given, and with a joyful toss of their trunks in the air, in they dashed, drinking, wallowing, and rolling over with delight, till one would have thought it had been years since they had tasted a drop of water, or known the pleasures of a bath. From his perch in the tree, Major Skinner had been watching with interest the movement of the herd, and when he saw that they had really had their fill, he gently broke a little twig and threw it on the ground. It seemed hardly possible that such a tiny sound could reach the ears of those great tumbling, sucking bodies, but in one instant they were all out of the tank and tearing towards the forest, almost carrying the little ones between them. Of course, it is not always that elephants can find tanks without traveling many hundreds of miles after them, and on these occasions their wonderful sagacity comes to their aid. They will pause on the banks of some dried-up river, now nothing but a sandy tract, and feel instinctively that underneath that sand is the water for which they thirst. But then, how to get at it? The elephants know as well as any engineer that if they tried to dig a hole straight down, the weight of their bodies would pull down the whole side of the pit with them. So that is of no use. In order to get round this difficulty, long experience has taught them that they must make one side to their well a gentle slope, and when this is done they can wait with perfect comfort for the water, whose appearance on the surface is only a question of time. Much might be written about the likes and dislikes of elephants, which seem as a rule to be as motiveless as the likes and dislikes of human beings. Till they are tamed and treated kindly by some particular person, elephants show a decided objection to human beings, and in Ceylon have a greater repugnance to a white skin than to a brown one. In fact, they are shy of anything new or strange, but will put up with any animal to which they are accustomed. Elks, pigs, deer, and buffaloes are their feeding companions, and the elephants take no more notice of their presence than if they were so many canaries. Indeed, as far as can be gathered, the elephant is much more afraid of the little domestic animals with which it is quite unacquainted than of the huge vegetable-eating beasts with which both it and its forefathers were on intimate terms. Goats and sheep it eyes with annoyance. They are new creatures, and were never seen in jungles or forests. But, bad as they might be, dogs, the shadows of men, were worse still. They were so quick, so lively, and had such hideous high voices, which they were always using, not keeping them for special occasions like any self-respecting quadruped. Really, they might almost as well be parrots with their incessant chatter. But of all kinds of dogs, surely the one called Scotch Terrier was the most alarming and detestable. One day an animal of this species actually seized the trunk of an elephant in its teeth, and the elephant was so surprised and frightened that it fell on its knees at once. At this the dog was a little frightened too, and let go, but recovered itself again as the elephant rose slowly to its feet and prepared to charge afresh. The elephant, not knowing what to make of it, backed in alarm. hitting out at the dog with its front paws, but taking care to keep his wounded trunk well beyond its reach. At last, between fright and annoyance, he lost his head completely, and would have fairly run away if the keeper had not come in and put a stop to the dog's fun. If Aesop had known elephants or Scotch terriers, he might have made a fable out of this, but they had not visited Greece in his day. End of section 50. Recording by Narrator J.
Section 51 of the Animal Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. The Animal Story Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Bungie by Mr. Jesse. Bungie from Jesse's British Dogs. During the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and James, there lived a brave and accomplished knight called Sir John Harington, who had been knighted on the field of battle by the famous Earl of Essex, and had translated into English a long poem by an Italian called Ariosto. But busy though he was in so many ways, Sir John still had time to spare for his raw dog, Bungie, and in the year 1608 he writes a long letter to Prince Henry, elder brother of Charles I. Full of the strange doings of his favorite. Bungie seems to have been used by Sir John as a sort of carrier pigeon, and he tells how he would go from Bath to Greenwich Palace to deliver up to the court there such matters as were entrusted to his care. The nobles of the court made much of him, and sometimes gave him errands of their own, and it was never told to their Lady Queen that this messenger did ever blab aught concerning his high trust, as others have done in more special matters. More wonderful even than this was his behavior concerning 2 sacks of wheat which Bungie had been commissioned by Sir John's servant Combe to carry back from Bath to his own house at Kelston, a few miles distant. The sacks were tied round the dog's body by cords, but on the way the cords got loose, and Bungie, clever though he was, could not tie them up again. However, he was not beaten, and hiding one flasket in some bushes that grew near by, he bore the other in his teeth to Kelston, and then returning, fetched the hidden one out of the rushes, and arrived with it in good time for dinner. Sir John is plainly rather afraid that Prince Henry might not quite believe this instance of sagacity, for he adds, "Hereat your highness may perchance marvel and doubt, but we have living testimony of those who wrought in the fields, and espied his work, and now live to tell they did much long to play the dog, and give stowage to the wine themselves, but they did refrain, and watched the passing of this whole business." As may be well guessed, the fame of Bungie's talents soon spread, and then, as now, there were many dog stealers in the country. On one occasion, as Sir John was riding from Bath to London, Bungie was tempted to leave his side by the sight of a pond swarming with wild duck or mallard. Unluckily other people besides Bungie thought it good sport to hunt wild fowl, and did not mind seizing valuable dogs, so poor Bungie was caught and bound, till it could be settled who would give the highest price for him. At last his captors decided that they would take him to London, which was not very far off, and trust to chance for finding a buyer. As it happened, the Spanish ambassador was on the lookout for a dog of that very kind, and he was so pleased with Bungie that he readily agreed to give him the large sum asked by the men who brought him. Now Bungie was a dog who always made the best of things, and as Sir John tells the prince, "Such was the court he did pay to the Don, that he was no less in good liking there than at home." In fact, everybody grew so fond of him that when after 6 weeks Sir John discovered where he was and laid claim to him, no one in the house could be prevailed on to give him up. Poor Sir John, who, as we know, was very much attached to Bungie, was at his wits' end what to do. when it suddenly occurred to him to let the dog himself prove who was his real master. So having the ambassador's leave to what he wished in the matter, he called all the company together at dinner time, and bade Bungy go into the hall where dinner was already served, and bring a pheasant from the dish. This, as Sir John says, created such mirth, but much more, when he returned at my commandment to the table, and put it again in the same cover. After such a proof there was no more to be said, and Sir John was allowed to be the dog's master. But Bungy's life was not destined to be a very long one, and his death was strange and sudden. As he and his master were once more on the road from London to Bath on their return journey, he began jumping up on the horse's neck, and was more earnest in fawning and courting my notice than what I had observed from time back, and after my chiding his disturbing my passing forward, he gave me some glances of such affection as he moved me to cajole him, but alas! He crept suddenly into a thorny brake, and died in a short time. It is impossible to guess what kind of illness caused the death of poor Bungy, but it is pleasant to think that Sir John never forgot him, and also loved to talk of him to his friends. Now let Ulysses praise his dog Argus, he writes to Prince Henry, or Tobit be led by that dog, whose name doth not appear. Yet could I say such things of my Bungy as might shame them both, either for good faith, clear wit, or wonderful deeds. To say no more than I have said of his bearing letters to London and Greenwich, more than 100 miles, as I doubt not but your highness would love my dog, if not myself. I have been thus tedious in his story, and again say, that all the dogs near your father's court, not one hath more love, more diligence to please, or less pay for pleasing, than him I write of. End of section 51.
Section 52 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca Zimmerman, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 52, Lions and Their Ways, by William Bingley. Although it would not be safe to put oneself into the power of a lion, trusting to its generosity to make friends, there are a great many stories of the kindness of lions to other creatures, which are perfectly true. One day, more than 100 years ago, a lion cub only 3 months old was caught in one of the great forests near the river Senegal, and brought to a Frenchman as a gift. The Frenchman, who was fond of animals, undertook to train it, and as the cub was very gentle and quiet, this was easily done. He soon grew very fond of his master, and enjoyed being petted, both by him and his friends. And what was more strange in a beast whose forefathers had passed all their lives in solitude, the lion hated being by himself. The more the merrier was clearly his motto, and whether the company consisted of dogs, cats, ducks, sheep, geese, or monkeys, which were his bedfellows, or men and women, did not matter to him. And you may imagine his joy when one night, as he went to bed, he found 2 little new-born pups in his straw. He was quite as pleased as if he had been their mother. Indeed, he would hardly let the mother go near them, and when one of them died, he showed his grief in every possible way, and became still more attached to its brother. After 6 months, the lion, now more than a year old, was sent off to France, still with the little pup for company. At first his keepers thought that the strangeness of everything would make him frightened and savage, but he took it quite calmly, and was soon allowed to roam about the ship as he pleased. Even when he landed at Havre, he only had a rope attached to his collar, so he was brought to Versailles, the pup trotting happily by his side. Unfortunately, however, the climate of Europe did not agree with the dog as with the lion, for he gradually wasted away and died, to the terrible grief of his friend. Indeed, he was so unhappy that another dog was put into the cage to make up for the lost one. But this dog was not used to lions, and only knew that they were said to be savage beasts, so he tried to hide himself. The lion, whose sorrow, as often happens, only made him irritable and cross, was provoked by the dog's want of confidence in his kindness, and just gave him one pat with his paw which killed him on the spot. But still he continued so sad that the keepers made another effort. And this time the dog behaved with more sense, and coaxed the lion into making friends. The two lived happily together for many years, and the lion recovered some of his spirits. But he never forgot his first companion, or was quite the same lion again. Many hundreds of miles south of Senegal, a Hottentot who lived in Namaqualand was one evening driving down a herd of his master's cattle to drink in a pool of water which was fenced in by two steep walls of rock. It had been a particularly hot summer and the water was scarce, so the pool was lower than usual, and it was not until the whole herd had gotten close to the brink that the Hottentot noticed a huge lion lying right in the water, preparing to spring. The Hottentot, thinking as well as his fright would let him think at all, that anything would serve as supper for the lion, dashed straight through the herd and made as fast as he could for some trees at a little distance. But a low roar behind him told him that he had been wrong in his calculations, and that the lion was of opinion that man was nicer than bull. So he fled along as quickly as his trembling legs would let him, and just reached one of the trees aloes in which some steps had been cut by the natives, as the lion bounded into the air. However, the man swung himself out of his enemy's range, and the lion fell flat upon the ground. Now the branches of the tree were covered with hundreds of nests of a kind of bird called the sociable grosbeak, and it was to get these nests that the natives had cut in the smooth trunk the steps which had provided the salvation of the Hottentot. Behind the shelter of the nest the Hottentot cowered, hoping that when he was no longer seen the lion would forget him and go in search of other prey. But the lion seemed inclined to do nothing of the sort. For a long while he walked round and round the tree, and when he got tired of that, he lay down, resolved to tire the man out. The Hottentot, hearing no sound, peeped cautiously out to see if his foe was still there, and almost tumbled down in terror to meet the eyes of the lion glaring into his. So the two remained all through the night, and through the next day. But when sunset came, the lion could bear his dreadful thirst no longer, and trotted off to the nearest spring to drink. Then the Hottentot saw his chance, and leaving his hiding place, he ran like lightning to his home, which was only a mile distant. But the lion did not yield without a struggle, and traces were afterward found of his having returned to the tree, and then scented the man to within 300 yards of his hut. End of section 52. Recording by Rebecca Zimmerman. Section 53 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca Zimmerman, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Animal Storybook. Edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 53. The History of Jacko I by Alexander Dumas. Translated by Mrs. Blackley. The ship Roxalana of Marseille lay anchored in the Bay of Loando, which, as we all know, is situated in South Guinea. The Roxalana was a merchant vessel, and a brisk traffic had been going on for some time with the exchange of the European goods with which the ship had been laden, for ivory and other native produce. All hands were very busy getting on board the various provisions and other stores needed for a long voyage, for it was in the days of sailing vessels only, and it would be some time before they could hope to return to Marseille. Now, the captain of the Roxalana was a mighty hunter, and seeing that all was going on well under the first officer's direction, he took his gun and a holiday, and went up country for one more day's sport. He was as successful as he was brave, and he had the great good luck to meet a tiger, a young hippopotamus, and a boa constrictor. All these terrible creatures fell before the unerring aim of the Provincial Nimrod, and after so adventurous a morning's work, the captain naturally began to feel tired and hungry, so he sat down under the shade of some trees to rest and have some lunch. He drew a flask of rum out of one pocket, and having uncorked it, placed it on his right side. From his other pocket he produced a large guava, which he laid on his left side, and finally he drew a great wedge of ship biscuit from his game bag and put it between his knees. Then he took out his tobacco pouch and began to fill his pipe, so as to have it ready at hand when he had finished his meal. Imagine his surprise when, having filled his pipe, he found the flask had been upset and the guava had disappeared. I am afraid the captain made use of some very strong language, but there was nothing for it but to make the best of the biscuit, the sole relic of his feast. As he munched it, he warily turned his head from side to side, watching for the thief, when all of a sudden something fell upon his head. The captain put up his hand and found the skin of his guava. Then he raised his eyes and saw a monkey dancing for joy at his own pranks in the tree just above him. As I have already shown, the captain was an excellent shot. Without stirring from his seat, he took up his gun and with a shot snapped the end of the branch on which his persecutor was sitting. Down came the branch and the monkey, and the captain at once captured the latter before it had time to recover from the surprise of its rapid fall. He was small and quite young, only half-grown, but of a rather rare kind, as the captain, who had an ever-ready eye to the main chance, at once perceived. "Aha!" he said. "This little fellow will be worth 50 francs if he's worth a farthing by the time we get back to Marseille." So saying, he popped the monkey into his game bag and buttoned it carefully up. Then, feeling that a piece of biscuit was not quite a sufficient lunch after the fatigues of his morning's sports, he retraced his steps and returned to his ship in company with his monkey, whom he named Jacko. Before leaving Loando, the captain, who was fond of pets, bought a beautiful white cockatoo with a saffron crest and jet-black beak. Chautauqua, that was his harmonious name, was indeed a lovely creature, and extremely accomplished into the bargain. He spoke French, English, and Spanish equally well, and sang God Save the King and the Marseillaise and the Spanish national anthem with great perfection. The aptitude for languages made him a ready pupil, and his vocabulary was largely increased by daily association with the crew of the Roxalana, so that before they had been very long at sea, Chautauqua swore freely in the purest Provençal, to the delight and admiration of his captain. The captain was very fond of his two pets, and every morning, after inspecting the crew and giving each man his orders for the day, he would go up to Chautauqua's cage, followed by Jacko, and give the cockatoo a lesson. When this was well said, he would reward his pupil by sticking a lump of sugar between the wires of the cage, a reward which delighted Chautauqua, whilst it filled Jacko with jealousy. He too loved sugar, and the moment the captain's back was turned, he would draw near the cage and pull and pinch till the lump of sugar generally changed its destination, to the despair of Chautauqua, who, crest erect and with brandished claw, rent the air with shrieks of rage mingled with angry oaths. Jacko, meanwhile, stood by, affecting an innocent air, and gently sucking the sugar which he had stowed away in one of his pouches. Unluckily, none of Chautauqua's owners had taught him to cry, "Stop, thief!" and he soon realized that if Jacko were to be punished, he must see to it himself. So one day, when the monkey, after safely abstracting the sugar, pushed a paw between the bars of the cage to gather up some remaining crumbs, Chautauqua, who was gently swinging, head down, and apparently unconscious of what was going on, suddenly caught Jacko's thumb in his beak and bit it to the bone. Jacko uttered a piercing screech, rushed to the rigging, and climbed as far as he could, when he paused, clinging on by 3 paws and piteously brandishing the 4th in the air. Dinner time came, and the captain whistled for Jacko, but, contrary to all customs, no Jacko came. The captain whistled again, and this time he thought he heard an answering sound, which seemed to come from the sky. He raised his eyes and beheld Jacko, still waving his injured paw. Then began an exchange of signals, with the result that Jacko firmly refused to come down. Now the captain had trained his crew to habits of implicit obedience, and had no notion of having his orders resisted by a monkey, so he took his speaking trumpet and called for Doublemouth. Doublemouth was the cook's boy, and he had well earned his nickname by the manner in which he took advantage of his culinary position to make one meal before the usual dinner hour, without its interfering in the least with his enjoyment of a second at the proper time. At the captain's call, Doublemouth climbed on deck from the cook's galley and timidly approached his chief. The captain, who never wasted words on his subordinates, pointed to Jacko, and Doublemouth at once began to give chase with an activity which proved that the captain had chosen well. As a matter of fact, Jacko and Doublemouth were dear friends, the bond of sympathy which united them being one of greediness, for many a nice morsel Jacko had to thank the cook's boy for. So when the monkey saw who was coming, instead of trying to escape him, he ran to meet him, and in a few minutes the two friends, one in the other's arms, returned to the deck where the captain awaited them. The captain's one treatment for wounds of all kinds consisted of a compress steeped in some spirit, so he at once dipped a piece of rag in rum and bandaged the patient's thumb with it. The sting of the alcohol on the wound made Jacko dance with pain, but noticing that the moment the captain's back was turned, Doublemouth rapidly swallowed the remains of the liquid in which the rag had been dipped, he realized that however painful as a dressing, it might possibly be agreeable to the palate. He stretched out his tongue and very delicately touched the bandage with its tip. It was certainly rather nice, and he licked more boldly. By degrees the taste grew on him, and he ended by putting his thumb, bandage and all, into his mouth and sucking it bodily. The result was that, the captain having ordered the bandage to be wetted every 10 minutes, by the end of a couple hours Jacko began to blink and to roll his head, and as the treatment continued he had at length to be carried off by Doublemouth, who laid him on his own bed. Jacko slept without stirring for some hours. When he woke, the first thing which met his eyes was Doublemouth busy plucking a fowl. This was a new sight, but Jacko seemed to be particularly struck by it on this occasion. He got up from the bed and came near, his eyes steadily fixed on the fowl, and carefully watched how the whole operation proceeded. When it was ended, feeling his head a little heavy still, he went on deck to take the air. The weather was so settled, and the wind so favorable, that the captain thought it only a waste to keep the poultry on board alive too long, so he gave orders that a bird should be served daily for his dinner in addition to his usual rations. Soon after, a great cackling was heard amongst the hen coops, and Jacko climbed down from the yard where he was perched at such a rate that one might have thought he was hastening to the rescue. He tore into the kitchen, where he found Doublemouth already plucking a newly killed fowl, till not an atom of down was left on it. Jacko showed the deepest interest in the process, and on returning to the deck he, for the first time since his accident, approached Chautauqua's cage, carefully keeping beyond range of his beak, however. After strolling several times round, he at last seized a favorable moment, and clutching hold of one of Chautauqua's tail feathers, pulled hard till it came out regardless of the cockatoo's screams and flappings. This trifling experiment caused Jacko the greatest delight, and he fell to dancing on all fours, jumping up and falling back on the same spot, which all his life was the way in which he showed his supreme content about anything. Meantime, the ship had long lost sight of land, and was in full sail in mid-ocean. It appeared unnecessary to the captain, therefore, to keep his cockatoo shut up in a cage, so he opened the door and released the prisoner, there being no means of escaping beyond the ship. Chautauqua instantly took advantage of his freedom to climb to the top of one of the masts, where, with every appearance of rapture, he proceeded to regale the ship's company with his entire large and varied vocabulary, making quite as much noise by himself as all the 25 sailors who formed his audience. Whilst this exhibition was taking place on deck, a different scene was being enacted below. Jacko had, as usual, approached Doublemouth at plucking time, but this time the lad, who had noticed the extreme attention with which the monkey watched him, thought that possibly there might be some latent talent in him which was a pity not to develop. Doublemouth was one of those prompt and energetic persons who waste no time between an idea and its execution. Accordingly, he quietly closed the door, put a whip into his pocket in case of need, and handed Jacko the duck he was about to pluck, adding a significant touch to the handle of the whip as a hint. But Jacko needed neither hint nor urging. Without more ado, he took the duck, placed it between his knees as he had seen his tutor do, and fell to with a will. As he found the feathers giving place to down and the down to skin, he became quite enthusiastic, so much so that when his task was done, he fell to dancing for joy exactly as he had done the day before by Chautauqua's cage. Doublemouth was overjoyed for his part. He only regretted not having utilized Jacko's talent sooner, but he determined to do so regularly in the future. Next day the same operation took place, and on the third day Doublemouth, recognizing Jacko's genius, took off his own apron and tied it round his pupil, to whom from that moment on he resigned the charge of prepping the poultry for the spit. Jacko showed himself worthy of the confidence placed in him, and by the end of a week he had quite distanced his teacher in skill and quickness. Meantime the ship was nearing the equator. It was a peculiarly sultry day, when the very sky seemed to sink beneath its own weight. Not a creature was on deck but the man at the helm and Chautauqua in the shrouds. The captain had flung himself into his hammock and was smoking his pipe, whilst Doublemouth fanned him with a peacock's tail. Even Jacko seemed overcome by the heat, and instead of plucking his fowl as usual, he had placed it on a chair, taken off his apron, and appeared lost in slumber or meditation. His reverie, however, did not last long. He opened his eyes, glanced round him, picked up a feather which he first stuck carelessly in his mouth, and then dropped, and at length began to slowly climb the ladder leading on deck, pausing and loitering at each step. He found the deck deserted, which apparently pleased him, as he gave 2 or 3 little jumps, whilst he glanced about to look for Chautauqua, who with much gesticulation was singing God Save the King at the top of his voice. Then Jacko seemed to forget his rival's existence altogether, and began lazily to climb the rigging on the opposite side, where he indulged in various exercises, swinging by his tail head down, and generally appearing to have only come with a view to gymnastics. At length, seeing that Chautauqua took no notice of him, he quietly sidled that way, and at the very moment that the performance of the English national anthem was at its height, he seized the singer firmly with his left hand, just where the wings joined the body. Chautauqua uttered a wild note of terror, but no one was sufficiently awake to hear it. "By all the winds of heaven!" exclaimed the captain suddenly. "Here's a phenomenon! Snow under the equator!" "No," said Doublemouth. "That's not snow, that's— Ah, you rascal!" And he rushed toward the companion. "Well, what is it then?" asked the captain, rising in his hammock. "What is it?" cried Doublemouth from the top of the ladder. "It's Jacko plucking Chautauqua." The captain was on deck in 2 bounds, and with a shout of rage roused the whole crew from their slumbers. "Well," he roared to Doublemouth, "what are you about standing there? Come, be quick." Doublemouth did not wait to be told twice, but was up the rigging like a squirrel. Only the faster he climbed, the faster Jacko plucked, until, when the rescuer reached the spot, it was a sadly bare bird which he tore from Jacko's vindictive hands and carried back to his master. Needless to say that Jacko was in dire disgrace after this exploit. However, in time he was forgiven, and often amused the captain and crew with his pranks. When the Roxalana reached Marseille after a quick and prosperous voyage, he was sold for 75 francs to Eugene Isbey the painter, who gave him to Flero for a Turkish hookah, who in turn exchanged him for a Greek gun with Decam. End of section 53. Recording by Rebecca Zimmerman.